So you just bought your first camera and you want to learn how to use it. Well, my friend, you're in the right place. This video is exactly that. And if you haven't already, I recommend subscribing. Alright, so the first thing, and I believe is the most important thing that you need to know, is exposure triangle. Now, what is exposure triangle? It refers to aperture, which is how wide the opening of the camera or how much light enters your camera. Shutter speed, which is how long your film or your sensor is exposed to that light. And ISO, which means how sensitive to light your film or your sensor is. For this demonstration, I'll be using a film camera, but it will be same for whatever camera you're using, as long as you have a manual control over the camera. Alright, first off, what is aperture? Well, this refers to how much, as I said before, how much light enters the camera. It is mentioned in f-stop, so it determines how much light enters the camera. This literally opens or closes the opening of your camera to let in less light or more light. Now, a smaller number like f1.7 or 2 or 2.8 lets in quite a lot of light, and a higher number like f16 or f11 will let in less light because the opening is smaller. Because this is in fraction, we are dividing the focal length of the lens. In this case, the focal length is 50 millimeter. So we are dividing the 50 millimeter with these numbers to calculate how big our opening is. Now you might be thinking, why not to shoot at f1.8 or your widest opening all the time to let in the most light? Well, aperture does not only control how much light enters your camera, it also controls the depth of field. When you let in more light, less of the thing is in focus, which means you have shallow depth of field. So f1.8 will just have the subject in focus and the background will just disappear. f16 to say will have a lot of the thing in focus and also most of the background will be in the focus. f1.8 or f2.8, those wider numbers are really good for portrait photos, and f16, f8, they are really good for landscape. If aperture means how much light enters your camera, shutter speed, as I mentioned earlier, is how long the light hits the sensor or the film. It literally means how long the shutter of your camera stays open. In your digital camera, it probably would be mentioned in 1/60, 1/125. That is calculated in seconds. So it's like 1/2 of a second, 1/60th of a second. In film cameras, it's set in numbers, but it means the same thing. 1 means 1 second, 1/2 would be 1.5 seconds, and 1000 is 1,000th of a second. So if I put it in 1 second, it's much more easier to see how this shutter behaves. So here, it opens for 1 second and then closes. Now, just like aperture, it does not just control how long the light hits the sensor. It also controls motion or motion blur. If the shutter is fast, like 1,000th of a second or 1/500th of a second, you will freeze the motion. Imagine a car moving and you want to take a picture of it. If the shutter is open for longer, like 1 second or even longer than that, it will show the motion blur. So depending on the situation you're shooting, you will change or make adjustment to your shutter speed. And the last thing is ISO. So what is ISO? As I mentioned earlier, ISO is how sensitive your sensor or film is to light. In modern cameras, you can change your ISO in camera. In film, it is baked in your film, and you have to choose whatever ISO film you're shooting depending on how much light you have, and you grab that canister and then you shoot photos. So if you want to take picture in daylight, you'll choose a different ISO than if you're taking pictures indoor. Now, With ISO, the lower number, it's quite easy to understand. The lower number it is, the less light or less sensitive your film or sensor is. So a 100 ISO like this Kodak Gold would let in less light compared to this 400 ISO film. In digital camera, it's much more easier as you can control your ISO. And depending on the situation you're at and the light you have, you can change the ISO in a way that you balance your shutter speed and your aperture to your need. But do keep in mind, ISO also introduces noise or grain. The higher the number, like ISO 1600, would introduce much significant grain or noise to the image. And ISO 100 in general would have finer detail. However, if the situation calls for it, do not be afraid to crank up the ISO and take the picture. A grainy picture is better than extremely underexposed picture. Now that you know aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, here's how I would go by shooting picture. Depending on how much light I have, I will change my ISO. If I'm shooting outside, I will set my ISO to 100, or I will choose film that is 100 speed. And then I will go outside and I will think about what I am shooting. If I'm shooting portrait, I will set my aperture to f1.8, f2.8, or whatever the highest opening that I have access to, the smallest number I have access to in my lens. And then I will balance out the light by choosing my shutter speed. So how do I go on about balancing my light? Now I have to meter it. You see the numbers in my bottom row of my camera. You see the first one is shutter speed, the second one is aperture, third one is metering. There are some technical things about it, and this could be another video, but for now, think of your goal as making the meter be as 0. Your metering can be thrown off by bright subject like sun or a light bulb in your frame. So you have to think of that. And the final and most important advice that I can give to anybody is just go out and shoot. Your first photo might suck. Your 100th photo might suck. But the next photo you take will be an artistic masterpiece. So just go out there and shoot, and just remember, have fun.